It's that time of year again. I know how I'm going to be spending Halloween. Same way I have for the past 2 years. Slowly nursing a beer in the bar. Watching the glass sweats on that smooth wooden counter, staring at it till it goes warm in my hand. I'm not there to get drunk. I'm there to escape. I never want to be alone at home over Halloween night again. I promised that deputy that I wouldn't talk about that night. The town didn't need it. Hell, I even deleted the video. But now, with Halloween around the corner, it all comes back. Well, the small-town law enforcement doesn't care too much about Reddit. Much less no sleep. I live in a small house at the end of the lane. Another nondescript house down a road of its sisters. Prefabricated mostly. Far enough off the beaten path to be cheap. Not so far as to be rural. But close. Pretty damn close. I didn't expect many kids to call around trick-or-treating come Halloween. It's a long road, and most children manage to fill their baskets long before they get to my place. Besides, I quite like the peace and quiet. Halloween used to be a good night to settle down and catch some of the classic horror movies on TV. I kept a couple of bags of candy around just in case some kids actually made it all the way down to the lane. But mostly, it would be an evening all to myself. I can't quite remember what I was watching that night. Probably because I'd been enjoying an after-dinner beer and I may have gotten carried away, dozing off after one too many. I woke with a start. My beer had gone warm on the side table, my hand still curling around the can. I winced as I unwrapped my fingers. Something had woken me up. The TV droned on in the background and senseless drivel of late-night programming flickered across the room. Maybe it was just some high school kids out after some Halloween party, out on the street making some noise that woke me up. I checked the time. Past midnight. I was glad that I invested in a little security for my house. Just the basics, really. A good camera to cover my front lawn. Motion-activated lights around the front and back. I was trying to make the tough decision of whether to clear up the mess right then and there, or to just kick the can down to the road till the next morning. When a loud rapping at the door shattered the silence. The can bounced off the floor, warm beer spraying across the bottom of my track pants. The shock left me too numb even to swear. I just set the can back upright when the knocking sounded again. That arithmetic rap, increasingly impatient, the tempo building up as I stepped towards the door. I peered around the edge of the window. I saw nothing but my pale face in the glass. It was pitch dark outside. Why wasn't the light working? The knocking stopped. A tree branch, perhaps, or something else tapping on the porch. The peephole glared at me. That little glass orb suddenly bulged with some half-promised horror. I swallowed, I tried. My throat was dry. The warm beer on the floor suddenly inviting. It's nothing, I said out loud, hoping that the familiar echo of my voice off the walls would ground me somehow. I walked up to the door and peered out, only seeing the orange cones cast by the halogen streetlights a distance away. Nothing, I thought to myself. feeling childishly stupid. I sucked in a deep breath, feeling my lungs strain, then let the air stream out slowly. Then, another knock. I turned back around to face the door, my heart pounding at the inside of my chest, its crazed dance playing counterpoints to the knocking. I wasn't surprised to see my hand shake as I reached for the doorknob. Our town was a safe one, far from troubles of the big cities, or so we read in the papers. We had little more to fear in the night than seeing our trash strewn across the yard by the nimble fingers of raccoons. I threw the door open. The porch lights winked on, suddenly blinding me. I blinked away the white spots from my vision. A pair of children stood on my porch. They must have been 9 or 10. I couldn't see much of them, because they were in a classic Halloween getup. A simple sheet draped over each of them, a pair of holes cut out from them to see through. A pair of small baskets for candy broke the smooth lines of the sheets. The toes of brand new dress shoes peeked out from under the sheets. A boy and a girl, I thought. Trick or treat. Such a common refrain. I'd expected the words, but not the delivery. They were but 2 figures in front of me, yet their voices seemed to come from a great distance away. Trick or treat. The pair spoke again. I felt a little discomforted at the distortion in their voices. More than the weird volume, their voices seemed to blend into each other's, with some strange harmonics at play at the edges. It seemed as though there were a choir of 2 just there, speaking to me. Treat, I guess, I said. More than anything, I wanted those 2 away from my house. The whole situation felt wrong, the familiar veneer of the season concealing something deeper, something rotten, like that small panic when biting into a fruit and feeling the lack of resistance, your teeth sinking into soft mush instead of sweet flesh. For a moment, I blamed the haze of alcohol, the dregs of sleep clouding my judgment. But adrenaline had swept those far away. My fear was true. I turned to the counter where I kept my keys and grabbed for the bag of candy I'd prepared for the occasion. I was half hoping that the 2 figures would be gone when I returned to the door, that they'd been a figment of my imagination, perhaps a shadow of some dream brought on by creep horror movies and cold pizza. I had no such luck. The pair hadn't moved an inch. They each raised their baskets. There was already an assortment of candy there. They'd had a good day. A bit late for you guys to be out, isn't it? Where are your parents? The only answer I got was an impatient shaking of the baskets, the rasp of candy wrappers rustling. I held out a handful of candy, ready to drop it and call it a night. I expected to see a small, pale hand clutching at the handle of the basket. Instead, I saw the anemic, matte sheen of plastic. The basket was draped off the plastic hand of some kind of store mannequin. I was more than thoroughly creeped out by this effective little trick. I shrugged. Maybe the voices were recorded. A little technology to bolster an otherwise traditional costume. I felt the fear melting away as I explained it to myself in my head. Just some clever little children, probably with the help of an adult. Smart, I thought. It had certainly got me going for a while. Stay safe, I told them, dropping the last of the candy into the baskets. They didn't acknowledge me. They just stood still on the worn wooden boards of my porch. I shut the door on them, The window darkened as the light on the porch shut off. Odd. Maybe the motion detector stopped working. Some unbidden instinct told me to stay there and wait. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch as the two walked off. Still, the light stayed dark. My relief grew as the odd strangers left the property. Still, something wasn't right. The light was working. It turned on when it detected me. It saw me. It didn't see the kids. The sensor was working. It was state-of-the-art, passive infrared, detected motion by detecting changes in temperature. Like a human body. Like mine, but not the kids. Whatever was under those pristine white sheets wasn't warm at all. The realization washed over me like an ice cube running down my spine. My breath came in short rasps. I had to see. I had to know. I could barely bring my hand to the curtains. They were shaking so bad. When I pinched the edge of the curtains between my thumb and my finger, the curtain began to undulate wildly. I filled my lungs and peered out through the glass. They were still there, barely 20 yards away, doing nothing. Just standing there, motionless, facing the street. As I watched, they both swiveled their heads in perfect tandem to affix 2 pairs of fathomless eye holes on the window. There was no way they could have seen me come to the window. I had to put the back of my hand in my mouth and bite down hard to keep from calling out. They knew I was there. I backed away from the window, dragging my leading feet over the carpeted floor. I barely noticed when my heel knocked the can back, the beer leaking out onto the carpet, leaving a widened patch in front of me. I couldn't believe the raw animal fear those two had summoned up in me. Every instinct I had told me to run. Run. Get help. Anything but stay and be trapped in my own house. What could I do? Call the police and tell them that I was scared of 2 little children trick-or-treating? Call one of my friends past midnight and ask them to come over, like a little boy crawling to his parents' room after a nightmare? The situation was ridiculous. My mind told me so. That there had to be a rational explanation for everything. But I could not explain away the light, fluttery feeling in my stomach. I could not rationalize the prickly lumps at the back of my throat. They'd only said 3 words to me, in those unearthly tones. Who knew how cold those lips were? I shut the door to the kitchen, the sound echoing through the empty house. I turned my chair to face the front door, and then I waited, white-knuckled, for the dawn to come. I must have fallen asleep sometime during that long, cold wait, not daring to move from my chair, paralyzed with fear that one of those shrouded children would appear at my window, or worse yet, behind me. But even the manic store of energy wore out as the night wound to a close. I was woken up by a polite knock on the front door. I sat bolt upright, nearly falling off my chair. I stumbled to the door, a hint of the dread from a few hours ago still lingering like a stale funk in the air. I checked the peephole again. This time, I was comforted with the well-scrubbed face of one of our town deputies. We'd been to school together. It was that kind of smallish town where you know almost everybody your age if they had history there. He was an earnest man, tough but fair. "Good morning, officer."
"Good morning,"
he replied. The sour look on his face told me that it was anything but that. His nose twitched as he took in the stale, sour smell of beer streaming off the floor in the morning sun.
"Had a good night last night?"
I thought back to the night before. No, I didn't. The lawman was quick to see the fleeting shadow of doubt wash across my face. He pressed home his advantage.
"You care to explain why you stole 2 mannequins from the store, dressed them up, and put them on your front lawn?"
He shifted to the side, and past his door-fitting bulk, I saw 2 familiar shapes on my lawn. My lungs wouldn't fill with air. They were still there. They'd been there the whole time.
"You okay, buddy?"
The big man leaned in, blocking my view, and steadied my shoulder with one of his strong hands. I brushed his hand off and lurched out into the yard, mindless of the freezing dew on my bare feet. The pair stood there, the draped sheets joined in between them. They were holding hands. The 2 of them were holding hands. I brought my palm down gingerly on the head of the one nearer to me. Hard. I felt it. I felt hard plastic. I whipped the sheet off with one smooth motion. I gave a strangled cry as I stared into the empty, green eyes of a child mannequin. I backed away. Too quickly. I ended up on my ass on the cold grass, clawing and scrambling backwards until I bumped into the solid legs of the deputy behind me. He'd been quick to recognize my unease earlier, and was just as quick to realize genuine fear. He hoisted me back to my feet and helped me back into my house.
"You mind telling me what all that was about?"
He dumped me onto the office chair in front of my computer. I tried, but I couldn't force the words out. The deputy sighed and settled onto my couch, wrinkling his nose at the empty beer cans on the side table. He leaned forward.
First call the morning after Halloween, and I'm chasing down some bullshit break into a store in the middle of town. Now I've got you hungover and scared shitless from a damn pair of dolls in your yard. What I know is someone got into the store, smashed up the glass, stole some sheets and a couple of mannequins. Fucking kids again. Except the glass.
The lines on his brow deepened. I watched his Adam's apple bob up and down.
The glass was on the outside of the shop only. You have a camera in your yard, don't you?
I nodded numbly.
What say you give me another 10 minutes of your time tops? We go through that footage, I see you put those things on your lawn, and then I'll be out of your life. Hopefully for good.
I turned to face my computer and call up the stored videos on my hard drive. They were all transferred by Wi-Fi. Convenient for the time that I bought the cameras.
Just put it on double speed backwards. We'll see who set them there soon enough.
I hit the reverse play key and upped the speed. I saw the 2 of us scuffle from the house to the lawn and back again. Then the first rays of sun retreating from the grass, pulling back over the pair of figures, until they were back in darkness. The 2 of them stood there, motionless, for the longest time. When the 2 figures moved, all by themselves, in a jerky, swaying motion back from my lawn to my front door, the cursor danced a little jig in the corner of the screen as the shakes returned, stronger than before. The sharp hiss behind me told me I wasn't alone in my discomfort. I shuddered as I watched myself on screen. So close to the two abominations, giving them a handful of candy each. I slowed the recording back to normal speed. On screen, I saw myself turn back into the house to retrieve the candy. The two figures stood there, impassive. As one, they both fixed those dark eye holes on the sheets on the camera. There was something else. Unmistakable. There was a slight pulse in the sheets. A small undulation. The mannequins were breathing.
I've seen enough.
I turned to look at the deputy, his face as white as the sheets on the shrouded figures on the screen. His hand tight around the grip of his sidearm. That, of all the things, scared me the most of all. A symbol of law and order who had seen the worst of what our little community has to offer. Just as scared as I was, and ready to pull a gun in my house. I clicked the window shut and got up. I wandered over to my cabinet. I pulled out a pair of tumblers and a bottle of the good stuff. The bottle gave a couple of contented glugs as I sloshed the rich golden whiskey into the glasses. I set one down in front of the other man and took a sip from my glass. A lawman could lose his job drinking on duty. The deputy didn't hesitate when he emptied half his glass. He didn't look at me when he spoke.
My Nana wasn't from around here. She was back from the old country across the sea. She hated Halloween. Said there were things out that night that weren't meant to be seen in the light of day. She told me that one single night of the year, some things were set loose. The candy and costumes were a new thing. Back in the past, on All Hallows Eve, good folk crossed themselves and prayed and stayed in. Whatever's on that recording, it's not what our town needs. You understand?
Dumb high school kids, I said, the lie taking shape and forming in my mouth, fooling around. The lie fleshed out, took on a veneer of credibility. That would be the explanation. No one had to know the dark kernel of that story.
And your camera was having technical difficulties.
Never was a good piece of equipment. Regretted buying it the same week. He stuck out his hand, and we shook on it. And I've kept my word to now. There isn't a good reason why I broke the promise. I'd never known true fear till that night. But I replay it in my head, over and over. The recording is long gone, of course, but every detail of that night has been branded on my mind. I remember the fear, but I cannot think of a single act the two of them had done to threaten me. Eerie, unnatural, but without a drop of malice. It'll be Halloween soon. I know where I'll be on that dark night. Some things roam the streets that shouldn't be there. The masks and costumes aren't always for the children. Sometimes they're there for the adults, for our own protection. After the deputy left, I watched the video forwards. Just once. I remember seeing the two figures on my lawn, slowly inching their hands up, locking them under the sheets, and waiting for the sun to rise. things that shouldn't be out on this good earth. But sometimes, just sometimes, they just want the simple things, like one last trick or treat.
About a year ago, I was on my way home from purchasing some groceries on a quiet, dark night. The way back home was fairly normal and nothing of note really happened. When it was time to unload and move everything to the house, I got this weird feeling that is hard to describe. Now, let me explain the way my street is set up. I live on a cul-de-sac in the suburbs. We also live across the train tracks, so it's usually fairly quiet unless the train is passing through and blaring. Because we only have streetlights on the main road, every other road is left to be engulfed in darkness, unfortunately. As I'm offloading my groceries, my garage door is open and is the only light to be seen amongst the dark housing area. Observing the sky around me, I notice a figure walking up the street. It's merely a silhouette from the darkness, and the contrast of the light denies any fine details to be shown. But, for some reason, I felt fear. Whatever this thing is, it was walking on all fours. The thing has skinny and tall, slender legs. It may be seldom, but not surprising to see animals wandering out, as we do live by the woods as well. But I thought it was weird, as I had never seen an animal like that in this area before. The figure was unsettling to see, being alone in the night and all. Still curious, I saw the silhouette's neck move up, and I could tell it also had turned to look at me. Creeped out even more, I was ready to pack up as quick as possible. But then, the freaking thing starts approaching me. I want to say it ran, but I feel like that might be more of an exaggeration. Regardless, I shut off the light and closed my garage as quickly as possible and headed in for the night. I really did not want to meet whatever that freaking creature was. I was only 6 to 7 when this happened, but I remember everything. My mom had gone to work, so I stayed at home with my dad and little brother. My brother was playing with toys in the toy room while my dad and I were taking turns playing plug-and-play controllers. You will likely know what this is if you grew up in the early 2000s. Anyways, my dad had fallen asleep, so I ended up playing by myself. I was playing Mappy, a game about a mouse collecting artifacts and avoiding cats. I was pretty far into it, but my brother came up to me and wouldn't stop bothering me about something cool that he saw, and he wanted me to see it badly. I lost focus and ended up losing, so I said, "Fine, show me this stupid cool thing already," in the most annoyed tone a kid could give. Now, the one thing I left out about the toy room is that my dad had taken the door off and spun it around so that he could lock us in when we were bad. It was a pretty creepy room, mostly because it felt so empty and the light in the room was dim. My brother took me in the room and closed the door. I expected him to show me what he planned, but instead, he just turned around and smiled. I yelled at him over and over to show it to me, but he just kept smiling, and then eventually, the smile turned into a creepy laugh. I got tired of it and tried to leave the room to get back to my games, but it turns out my little brother locked the door. I yelled at him once more, but more aggressive this time. He just kept laughing. I started pounding on the door to wake my dad up. Then, I noticed my little brother had gone quiet. I turned around. He was now sitting on the toy slide we had in there. It was a small slide for babies, but he had a much more serious face. I actually got scared at that sight. He'd never made a face like that before. Then he looked up, and I did as well. He was looking at the vent on the ceiling. Then, I noticed something slowly starting to poke out. It was white, like paper white, and it was all wrinkly and veiny. If I had to describe it better, I'd say it looked like the forehead of a bald old man, slowly poking out, but the skin was just too white to be human. My eyes started to water and my brother began laughing again, louder than before. I started pounding on the door rapidly and screaming as loud as I could for my dad. I didn't dare look back again, but I heard it. I knew it wasn't human from the horrible sounds I had been making. My brother stopped laughing at that moment. But after that moment of me just pounding and nothing else, my brother let out a scream louder than I had ever heard. Like he was getting tortured. I still couldn't look back though. I was too scared. My crying and begging for the door to open just became louder. My dad then finally opened the door and I burst out. Only then did I look into the room, but there wasn't anything there, just my little brother crying and holding his leg. My dad went to check it out and he had a large deep cut on the side of his leg. I told my dad what happened, but he just gave me a hit in the back of the head for trying to lie, and my little brother, I could have sworn, had smiled at me again. But I didn't look too well, if I'm honest. I grew up starting to think it was just a nightmare, like I've been told every time I speak of this memory. And maybe it was, but my brother still has a scar on where I remember he had gotten cut. But I don't know if I believe it anymore.
Carnivorous Encounters by Timothy Duran. I want to start this off by saying that the greatest discovery of my entire scientific career just happened, and the possibility of this creature still being out in the wild terrifies me. I'm not exactly sure how I can put this, but I suppose I'll start by saying this. My name is Samuel Thompson, and I think I made the most deadly and terrifying discovery in biology of the decade. I'm a biologist out of Penn State, and decided to take a trip down to Costa Rica as part of my graduate study along with a few other students and researchers, and had been staying at a research facility there for a few weeks. Progress in regards to finding anything remarkable while out researching caecilians was minimal. We came across 2 or more of the common species and filmed their interactions the best that we could with our equipment. The problem with caecilians is that they are very elusive amphibians due to their secluded and underground living conditions. This made my research very difficult, or it did at least until yesterday. I woke up early this morning before sunrise so I could make my way out into the jungle on foot and try to search for the caecilians in the ground before the jungle came alive with other daytime animals and my fellow researchers. This kind of research would normally be better during the day, so burrows can be found more easily with the light of daytime to shine the way. The problem was really my patience. I had been out here for weeks already and had only come across 2 cases of caecilians, and those encounters were found by another researcher in our group. To say I was eager to make some discoveries of my own was a bit of an understatement. While I was out in the forest looking for caecilian burrows, I came across an absolutely massive hole nearby a stream in the ground that was a few feet wide and seemed to extend far down. I knelt down to examine the hole. I wanted to say that it was the burrow of some huge python, but it didn't show any of the sort of tunneling markings that a python showed. Weirder still, I saw large segmentations along the edges of the hole. I saw some wriggling going on near the ground where I was stepping. It had just rained earlier in the morning, and I reached down and picked up with my gloved hands out of the ground a wiggling caecilian. The strange thing about this caecilian was that it was positively humongous for something its size. I could tell it was in an earlier stage of development from the look of it, but it was the size of a fully grown caecilian and was positively huge. This was the start of a potentially enormous discovery. I was extremely excited to have found caecilians on my own and decided that the hole was worth investigating, but I didn't want to do it on my own. I placed the caecilian in a capture box that I had brought with me in my bag and took it back with me to the facility. I quickly made my way back, doing my best not to make the box or the caecilian bounce while I raced my way back. I got back about 20 minutes later to see that my group was just starting to wake up. I saw that Heather Laughlin was awake and was out of her cabin. She was the first person who had managed to find the 2 groups of caecilian before. I decided to tell her what I had found. "Heather, I found something while I was out looking for caecilians. I found a caecilian while I was out and wanted to bring it back so we could study it." Heather was a bit unimpressed by my finding at first. Yeah, we've already seen Sicilians before. They're all over the place if you dig deep enough. What makes this one so special? Was it near a stream or something? It was not only near a stream, but it was near an enormous hole in the ground. It had to have been at least a meter wide, and had this near it. I pulled out the Sicilian I captured and showed it to her. I handed the box over to her and she examined it as she moved it around to look at all sides of it. I commented on its appearance. See how it looks like it's in a larval stage? It looks like a barely developed Sicilian, but the size of it, it's huge, Heather said, slightly taken aback. Yeah, it is, I replied. This is a great find, Sam. I think we should get our equipment and head out there to find this hole. It could be something big. Hang on, Heather. I haven't had breakfast. I'll head out with you and the others in a bit. She sighed and started to walk off with the Sicilian. Go and grab some breakfast. I'll put away the Sicilian and we can go out with the others to find that hole and the other Sicilians. I went into the mess hall of the facility to go and grab myself some breakfast, but when I came back out, Heather and the others had left. I was frustrated. Damn it! They left without me. I didn't want to accept it, but at the back of my mind, I knew that Heather and the others would leave without me. It seemed like something Heather would do. I went back to my cabin and grabbed my equipment and some more capture boxes, and decided to hook a GoPro camera to my backpack strap and one to a mount that I wore on my head. I turned it on right as I left the cabin and hit record. After I made sure everyone else was gone, I went ahead and made my way back to the hole in the stream. The further and further I made my way up to the hole, though, the more and more I began to grow nervous. The normal rainforest birds weren't making calls, and I couldn't find any traces of the group at all. I hastened my pace as I made my way over to the hole and started to run once I started to hear screams. I started to sprint when I heard Heather scream for help. A moment later, I arrived at the hole to see fresh tracks around it. I turned on my torch and started to look around the inside of the hole. But as soon as I started to look down at the edge of the hole, something came up from behind me and shoved me inside. I gave a small scream as I fell down the hole and tumbled down the inside of the hole a good 20 feet before I stopped rolling. I quickly reached in the dark for my torch and aimed it in the direction of the sounds I began to hear in the hole. It sounded like hundreds of things were rolling around on the ground nearby me. I moved my torch in all directions and saw Sicilians everywhere. They were enormous in size. They were the size of goats, but even more massive was the Sicilian that loomed nearby me. I shined my light along its body and was horrified by its size. It loomed over me like an enormous snake, ready to sink its teeth into me, but it wasn't trained on me. Its attention was trained on Heather. I realized that none of the group members were around and saw it was only her. Heather saw me with the torch in my hand and screamed at me, "Sam, help me, please!" But before I could reach her, the Sicilian grabbed Heather in its mouth and threw her into the pile of squirming Sicilians. I barely had enough time to watch Heather sink beneath the squirming babies. They began to lash out at her clothes. I instinctively began to run as I heard her horrific screams of agony as the Sicilians ripped and teared at her flesh. I saw some vines dangling at the edge of the hole and began to climb them. However, the giant Sicilian wasn't done with me just yet. It grabbed at my backpack and tried to pull it off of me. I quickly thought to remove the backpack and let it fall into the pit. I climbed frantically out of the hole and made a run for it back to the facility. I never turned my back once until I made it back to the facility and told some of the workers there what had happened. They didn't believe me until I removed the GoPro from my forehead and showed them the footage of the Sicilians on the hole. I was doing this as a project that was in conjunction with the local Costa Rican government. The researchers that remained at the facility immediately reported of the missing group and the footage that I captured of the dangerous Sicilians. They decided that killing them off was the best option. Today, they sent in a group of experts to kill the Sicilians with a special kind of poison and sent in people to investigate the den and retrieve whatever they could. They managed to retrieve my gear and the gear of my group, along with the bones and remains of a few of them. Most of them had their bones crushed and their skulls broken open. Many were missing eyeballs and various parts of their bodies. Heather's corpse was the most gruesome. But what terrified me the most about this whole ordeal was two things. The first thing was that I still didn't know what pushed me into that hole, and I suspected it could have been a Sicilian, judging by the residue that was left on the back of my pants when I was shoved. The second thing was that as I looked through the footage on my GoPro and saw that it fell right next to my torch, I saw that there were some Sicilians that seemed to escape through the tunnels. I think that these were babies of the giant Sicilian and decided to leave the den after they were done feeding on my group. One thing is for certain. This group of Sicilians is likely a new species and is still out there somewhere. Like I said before, though, I may have made the most terrifying discovery of the decade, and I feel that my research on these creatures is only just beginning.
About 20 years ago, when I was 5 going on 6, I dressed up as Pennywise the Clown for Halloween. I wore the costume all day due to my school letting us wear them for parties in our classes. When we were dismissed from school, my father met me with a pleasant surprise. He was dressed in a yellow raincoat and had a hat on, and he was Georgie from the movie It. He held my hand as we went to the car, then we drove home. A few hours go by, and my father took me out to go trick-or-treating because my mother wasn't feeling too well. The night went on as scheduled, kids bombarding doors for candy, teenagers scaring each other, and parents losing their kids. Everyone loved our costumes. Again, I was Pennywise the Clown and he was Georgie from the 1990 It. My father held my hand in between each house and waited at the end of each driveway. One house took longer than others, and I remember that I was very anxious. Once I received my candy, I remember that there were more people than usual, and I had to run through a crowd to get to my father. I reached him, held his hand, and off we went, but it was the opposite direction of where we initially were going. I didn't think anything of it because of how young I was. We went down one of the dark back streets where our garbage was picked up for some reason, and we were walking unusually fast. I remember that I said, "Daddy," but my father started moving faster and didn't answer me. Then all of a sudden, I heard my name yelled out from about 25 yards behind us, and it was my father's voice. I looked back and it was my father. I looked up at the person that I was walking with, and he had on the same costume as my dad, but when I looked closer, I noticed it wasn't him. I looked at my dad and yelled out to him. The man then let me go, and as soon as he saw my father, he started running, and my father was running full speed at us. The man took off down the alley, then through a backyard. My father reached me and he was out of breath while he was hugging and kissing me, also asking me if I was okay. My father called the cops and explained to them that he lost track of me in a huge crowd at one of the houses and that there was some sick guy roaming our neighborhood. Once we got home, he told my mother everything that happened. He told her that a crowd gathered and some random guy with some costume the same as him walked up to him while I approached the porch. He told her that the guy said I was a cute kid. They wanted to just snatch me up in a joking manner. Then the crowd gathered even more, and he lost track of me until he saw us turn the corner onto the back street, and that's when he started to run after us and yell my name. Now looking back, I bet my father was losing his mind and probably wanted to kill that guy when he saw us together. Until this day, I'm grateful that my father found us when he did, because who knows what would have happened to me.
Most of us feel quite safe when the weather turns bad. We have houses, castles of steel, plaster, and wood. We have television and the internet, systems to warn us about anything actually dangerous. Modern life serves every need. Aside from natural disasters, weather rarely poses a problem in the 21st century. Gone are the days of muddy caves, of huts and villages. Now we live in monuments to our achievements. And so, when rain comes down in sheets, when cracks of light split the air open and reverberating rumbles follow. We feel nothing but excitement. But sometimes, the atmosphere beyond our walls is violent enough to unnerve us. The wind is powerful enough to make our houses creak, and the tap of the rain turns into a roar. Then thunder erupts just outside, impossibly loud. The ground shakes, and for a moment, a primal urge to hide takes over. Our instincts are buried deep, but the untamed might of a storm can dredge them up. Because at the core, we're still frightened animals. We just upgraded our caves. It was on such a thunderous night that I spoke to the Soul Eater. I'd finished my evening rituals and crawled under my sheets. The noise of the rain comforted me at first, a soothing static lull. But when the storm intensified, my breath grew shallow with anxiety. I've never bothered with psychiatric help, so I don't know what diagnosis they'd give my brain. But whatever plagues me, it's twisted my thoughts since childhood. I thought about my mind a lot that night, laying in my bed as the window flashed with lightning. Why am I the way that I am? What does it mean to be me? Is it even worth being me? These questions swirled in my head as the storm raged outside. I found no answers. The interesting thing was that most people would actually want to be me, or at least to live my lifestyle. I'd found my success in writing thriller novels, and my possessions were impressive. My house was grand and stately, situated in a woodland corner of a nice neighborhood. Yet it was empty. Nobody shared my home with me. I was also empty myself. I had nobody with which to share my true self. I was hyper-conscious of the fact that I'd missed out on young love. That beautiful, blissful experience. 30 years old and alone? Sure, I could find someone, but the damage of loneliness had already been done. And since I wasn't living for somebody else, what was I really living for? I'd never particularly enjoyed life. When I was a teenager, I lived because I had a future. When I was in my early 20s, I lived to take care of my mother. When I was in my late 20s, I lived because I had stories to tell. Now that future was here. My mother was gone and my stories were told. What was left? Years of rotting in this mansion? Of trying to recover the feeling of youth I wasted? It would never return. Not much of a point in continuing. The thunder rang out like 1,000 simultaneous gunshots. My house, my enormous empty house shuddered, shaking dust from the ceiling. Instinctively, I pulled the blankets over my head, before a sense of shame from my childish reaction took over and forced the covers back down. I realized I needed to sleep. My thoughts were taking a dark turn. My emotions were bubbling to the surface, dredged up by the storm. I tried to lie still and shut off my thoughts. Seconds turned to minutes, then to hours. I was preparing myself to go grab some Ambien when another crack of thunder exploded over the house. As the rumble faded, I heard something else. A dull thud from downstairs. The front door had been slammed shut. I remembered locking it that night. I lay quietly, pondering. A robbery? Should I call the cops or pretend to sleep? What if it wasn't a robbery at all? Perhaps some poor soul caught in the storm had sought shelter. Called a deep voice from outside my room. My heart froze. Goosebumps broke out across my entire body. Whoever was out there, they sounded like no human I'd ever met before. I tried to sit upright, but nothing happened. I couldn't move. It was like I was held in place by an invisible weight. Sleep paralysis. It had happened to me from time to time. The phenomenon always carried a heavy burden of fear, due to a concoction of hallucinations. But this time, I found it somewhat reassuring. It meant the voice outside the door wasn't real. I held my breath as the doorknob turned. Slowly, agonizingly. My bedroom door creaked as it swung open, and a figure came into view. The man was floating, horizontally as if he lay face down on thin air. As he drifted across the room and over my bed, I had a sickening realization. It was me. My body, my face, even the pajamas that I had at that very moment. He became motionless as he hovered directly above me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then his mouth moved. And the voice that emerged was so alien, I couldn't imagine it syncing with a person's lips, much less my own.
Hello, Nicholas.
Deep, knowing, mournful, as if the ocean could speak. And above that, a barely perceptible static buzz in the words. I only stared. Come on now. Be polite, chided the ghost. I found I could speak. You're not real, I told him. At this, my face, suspended just a few feet above me, only smiled. I was thinking we could have a conversation tonight. The hallucination's voice boomed around the room, echoing more distant corners of the house. About what? I asked him. I tried to move my arms and legs, but they refused to respond. It was going to be a long night. Life, death, you. I answered with a stare, at which the facsimile of me broke into an even larger grin. Let's start with the question. Why are you still alive? Of course he knew my thoughts. This was, after all, my dream. Still, a weird feeling crept through my paralyzed body when he mentioned the exact same question I just asked myself. Because my life has value, I answered. Hardly a satisfactory answer, Nicholas. Why does your life have value? The ghost said in that unearthly voice. I hesitated for a few moments. There are good things in my life. I eat well, I relax, I want for nothing. Good? The floating version of me chuckled. Eating well is good? Relaxing is good? What about the bad, Nicholas? It doesn't matter how satisfied your material urges are if your soul is diseased. I didn't answer. The fear that had dissipated minutes ago returned at the words. This didn't feel like a normal dream. Ponder this. How does the good in your life compare to the bad? The negatives are overwhelming. You have more regret than pride. You have more anger than joy. You have more aches and pains than comfortable moments. And your loneliness outweighs your love with the gravity of a world. Shut up! I told the thing and shut my eyes. Again, I tried to move. And again, my body failed me. No. The word resounded, sonorous and static from inches above my face. I opened my eyes and found the ghost had moved much closer. The smile had left its face. Every moment is a battle between joy and pain, and which one wins the majority of the time? There's no formula I can contrive to prove this to you, but you know the truth, deep within you. You see, Nicholas, here's the truly sad aspect of all of this. You live a better life than the vast majority of humans that have ever lived, and you're still unhappy. What does that tell you about life? Life is suffering. I conceded. It was a mantra some of my characters like to repeat. He smiled again, suspended over me and floating upwards a few inches. I hated my own face at that moment, a taunting and smug grin. So I live. His question came out as a whisper that held more menace than any of the previous booming statements. I stared up at the being. Fate, I answered after a minute. His laugh was loud and rolling, like a series of crashing waves. Faith, he repeated. Faith in what? Life is made of uncertainty. What if there's someone up there? Someone up there? You pitiful thing. You must know there's nobody, nothing. And if, by some great accident, there was a being that created you, would you not curse it for your flaws? For the suffering inherent in what you are? A God which created you would be nothing short of evil. I can't explain it, and I don't have to. That's what faith is, a passion of something greater than yourself. But as I said the words, I knew I didn't believe them. I'd never been religious. Liar, taunted the ghost as he pointed an arm down at me. And even if you weren't attempting to deceive yourself, think of the very notion of the grand scheme of things. Some kind of cosmic plan. Is it truly a comforting idea? That you are merely a cog in the machine created by an incomprehensible force? A cold feeling spread through me at that, but I forced myself to ignore it. I kept forgetting it was still a dream, only a manifestation of my subconscious. I couldn't let it disturb me, but there was something about the way the ghost moved and spoke that wasn't right. It was like no sleep paralysis episode I'd ever suffered. Nicholas, why live? Asked the hallucination once more. Because the future, I answered. He smiled and opened his mouth, but I cut him off. And no, not because I think I'm destined to be successful like I used to think. I mean because I can wake up tomorrow and go to Europe. Because I can choose to do anything I want. Maybe I am unhappy. Maybe there's literally nothing divine out there, but I have the freedom to choose my life. I felt determined to beat this thing. As I understood it, the dream would end when I proved him wrong, showed him that my life was worth living. He stared down at me, not visibly angry, but when he spoke, that static buzz in his voice was once more noticeable. Wrong. For the first time, I noticed his eyes. They were not exactly like mine. Some kind of yellow tint pervaded them. Wrong, he said again. You aren't free, you worm. You are a puppet, a biological object used to perpetuate your species. You say you can go to Europe tomorrow, but you won't. You can only do what urges tell you to do. You are the sum total of the forces that evolution built inside of you. That raised even more defiance in me. You know what? That doesn't even matter. I feel free, and so I am. Fundamentally, there's no difference in my reality either way. But Nicholas, even if you feel free, is that not a negative experience? Is there not horror in being forced into this world without meaning? A wanderer, condemned to seek something he can never find? As long as you hold this delusion close to your heart, that you are free, you will never be satisfied, because you must surely believe there is some combination of choices out there that will save you from what you are. The cold feeling returned, and I recognized it for what it was. The realization that the ghost was right. For all the malice and hopelessness that poured out of this grinning mouth, his refutations made sense. The ghost didn't stop. That's the bane of it all, really. Consciousness, the awareness, that sickening knowledge that you exist. Human beings, they don't really want to be beings. They just want to be. But you yourself cannot ever simply be, for it strives, constantly. Yourself, Nicholas, strives to disintegrate. Look behind the veil of most enjoyable activities in this life, and realize they are a process of becoming unself. Sex, drugs, love, even fun itself. Happiness is the process of killing self-awareness. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to move, hoping that the nightmare would end. When I opened them again, the ghost lay on top of me. I could see nothing but his eyes, so much like mine but with a strange yellow light behind them. "What do you want?" I asked him. "Your soul," he said. I thought I was just a biological creature without a soul, and it should be nothing to relinquish. "What do you want me to do?" I whispered. "Give up," he whispered back, and static filled the room. The ghost floated higher, nearly disappearing into the murky gloom of my high-arched ceiling. Then he began to change, and the facade of me, the facade of humanity, fell away like a withered leaf, and I saw how vast that thing truly was. It hung in the air like smoke, and filled the mind in a way that pushed out all ability to describe it. When I regained my words, I asked, "What are you?" "The Soul Eater," it said, a dry buzzing in its words. I didn't respond. "Nicholas, it's time," the demon told me. "Give in. Let me have it." The thing was right. It was right about me. It was right about the world. It was right about life. "No," I spat the word. Something in me wanted to live. The demon above me shifted and writhed. "Why?" "Because what is life for if not continuation? There's a force inside me and I want to preserve it. I don't care how shitty things are." The Soul Eater hissed. It grew until there was nothing else. And then it tried to strip my soul. There's not much I can say that will accurately describe what I felt at that moment. It should suffice to say that I'm scarred, and I'll never forget it. But I won. I fought off those grasping threats of spirit. Life won. Eventually, the Soul Eater withdrew. You and I, we will do this again. A lump of dread manifested in me. What if the being came when I was weak? Then I'd realized I just fought it off at my weakest moment. And some sort of pride filled me. "And I will win again," I told it. "You've won millions of times already. But on one of these repetitions, you will fail. You see, Nicholas, the universe repeats itself. It expands. It contracts. It re-expands. And every time, the same things happen. Almost. There are two things that change. The first is myself. I have been present for every rise and fall from the dawn of time and before. I exist in another place, in another way. The universe does not control me, and so I last, through the endless back and forth, living through realities as you live through minutes. The second, Nicholas, is that the universe is dying. Every expansion, every contraction, it grows weaker, fainter, and you right now are an uncountable number of expansions from the beginning. One of of these days, you will have faded enough to give in. There is a secret only I know, Nicholas. What? I asked, terrified to hear the answer. Everything has already ended. The thing hissed in a hoarse whisper. It's over. The universe once existed in glory, but it's dead now. You're just the fading ripples, a pale echo of what once was. And with that, the Soul Eater moved back through my door, out of my house and into the night. As soon as it left, I found I could move again. I held my hands to my face and cried. Just sobbed for the longest time. It had to have been the most traumatic dream of my life. But of course, it was just that. A dream. Sleep paralysis. A common psychological phenomenon. That didn't explain why my door was open. It's been 10 years since my conversation with the Soul Eater. My life is different now. I found a wife that I love. I had kids, little bundles of happiness and energy that exhaust and delight me. Gone are the days of me lying alone in my bed, staring up at the ceiling and wondering what I was missing. And so, when I have negative thoughts, when I begin to wonder if this world is worth living in, the answer is lying right next to me, in the rooms across the hall. But sometimes, I see a familiar figure in the distance outside my house, or whenever I'm driving the kids to school, I spot a glimpse of my doppelganger on the side of the road, floating just a few inches off the ground and grinning. And for a moment, I remember everything. I feel everything that I felt that night. I realized I've buried the truth with a textbook lifestyle designed to be fulfilling. Because at the core, I'm still a lonely animal fending off the truth of an uncaring world. I just upgraded my defenses.
I have a confession to make. I have been trying so hard to forget what I saw. But now that Halloween is right around the corner again, all these memories resurfaced all of a sudden. I now know it was wrong to keep my mouth shut. But before I tell my husband about it, and later on the authorities, I want to get it off my chest anonymously. Maybe this will help me confessing to my loved ones. My son, I'll call him Al for the sake of this story, is crazy about Halloween. Each year he dresses up as a zombie. Al loves zombies. Last year he begged and pleaded with me to let him go trick-or-treating with his friends. I used to always come along, but that year he wanted to go without adult supervision. Just him and his buddies. He was 10 years old at the time and pretty mature already. I was reluctant at first, but after thinking it over for a while, I approved. We live in a friendly, rural neighborhood bordering on large cornfields. Everyone knows everyone. I figured that they would be fine. The kid needed his freedom after all. Plus, his friend Amy would come along as well. She was 12 years old already and always reminded her younger friends to behave. However, one last glimpse of uncertainty within me caused me to decide that I would sneakily follow behind them to keep an eye on Al from a distance without bothering him, just to be absolutely safe. I did as planned, and on Hallows Eve, I let my son put on his costume and painted him some spooky zombie makeup, complete with sprinkles of fake blood on his ripped clothing and smears of it around his mouth. He took a look into the mirror and let out a squeal of delight. He hugged me, grabbed his little bag, and rushed outside. I waited a bit before going outside myself. His father wasn't home that night, so I left a bowl of candy on the front porch in hopes of it not being raided immediately. Upon walking out the door, I saw Al run towards a small group of other kids in fancy costumes. I recognized them all. There was Amy in her witch costume. Our neighbor's son, Mark, was a vampire, and there was a ghost whom I could only assume was Al's best friend Blake. I smiled at the sweet sight. It was always the four of them. I followed them at a safe distance, trying not to catch their attention. I watched as they rang at the doors of several other houses on their harvest, growing more and more cheerful the more candy they received. It was obvious that Amy wasn't too fond of Al's costume, though. From time to time, my son would scare her by jumping in front of her all of a sudden or making creepy sounds. Amy would shriek loudly every single time before bursting out into laughter. At some point along the way, they began developing Al's zombie scares into a full-on game of catch, my son merrily chasing around the others who, happily giggling, tried to avoid him. It was adorable to watch them play. I knew they weren't little anymore, but it still warmed my heart. They had reached the end of the main road and were still playing catch. They were enjoying themselves, and I was content, until Amy suddenly ran off into the cornfield at the side of the road. Al, Mark, and Blake followed her, howling like little monsters along the way. I was taken aback. The cornfields were large, and children, or rather residents of our neighborhood in general, were forbidden from entering it. Not because they would trample down the corn, but because people had gotten lost in there before. I couldn't help but instantly get worried. I hurried to run after them, but seeing as I was in pretty bad shape, it took me a while to find them. When I finally caught up with them, I found that they had gathered at the side of the field. Amy was still chuckling, but completely out of breath.
Give me a second, you guys.
She panted.
Aw, come on!
Blake argued from underneath his white cloak. Playing zombie is so much fun, Al cheered. In the heat of the game, he had completely given up on his usually calm demeanor and was losing himself in a fit of giggles. Can we keep playing zombie, please?
Yeah, just give me a second, guys,
Amy repeated. She was still bent over and trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, the three boys stuck their heads together and began murmuring something amongst themselves, out of earshot from Amy.
What? What are you talking about?
The young girl asked.
We're playing zombie. For real this time,
my son exclaimed. I frowned in confusion, but stayed where I was. I watched as Blake and Mark strode towards Amy and grabbed her by the arms. It's okay, they're just trying to scare her again, I told myself. But that notion was quickly knocked out of me when Al suddenly picked up a large stone from the dusty ground, his skinny arms struggling to lift the heavy thing. Slowly, in a pace almost menacing, he made his way over to Amy. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to dash out of my hiding spot and stop him, tear that rock out of his hands. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Tears began welling up in my eyes and running down my cheeks as my mouth dropped open, trying to form sounds, to somehow produce the shriek I was hoping for, but to no avail. I tried to move. I tried so hard, but I just couldn't. My body didn't obey me. I watched in horror as my son lifted the rock above his head and brought it down on the screaming, struggling girl's head. He did it again, then again, then again. My son, my child, my flesh and blood bashed his friend's skull in. Blood was gushing everywhere, onto my son's hands, his face, his costume. Al let go of the stone and knelt down and fumbled around in the remains of Amy's head. I felt vomit rise into my throat when I realized what he was doing. I remained paralyzed with fear, terror, and disgust as my son carefully picked at the bloody, gory mess and slowly led bits of Amy's brains to his mouth. One by one they vanished in between his lips like trick-or-treat candy. I didn't stay to watch Mark and Blake join him. When I finally regained control over my body, I simply turned and ran. I ran all the way back home, tears of shock still gushing out of my eyes. I barely made it to the bathroom before I started vomiting. When Al came home later that evening, I didn't come out to greet him. I wouldn't have dared to look into his eyes. I wouldn't have been able to. I haven't been able to look at him the same way ever since. I don't know why he did such a thing. Was it my fault? Where did I go wrong? How did my sweet little boy turn into a monster? I've pretended that everything was fine for almost a whole year now. Every time I would run into Mark's or Blake's parents on my way around town, every time I would pick up my son from school, I pretended I never saw what I saw. They found Amy's corpse the day after Halloween. The police never found out who had done it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing this right now. No suspects were ever arrested either. When they questioned my son, he lied through his teeth. Amy's parents moved away not long after. They couldn't stand being in that home in which they had made so many memories with their daughter. I know I should have told the police, and I hate myself for being too weak to do the right thing. I was scared. Scared of my own son, but at the same time, scared of losing him too. I hate myself for not helping Amy. I don't know why I was unable to move, but had I been able to, if I could trade my life for hers, she would be standing here right now. I wish Halloween 2018 had never happened. It has left my son a killer, a sweet young girl dead, and me a guilt-stricken shell of my former self. I'm not stupid. I know that withholding information from the police in a case of child murder has severe legal consequences. I deserve everything that's coming to me, but so does he. I guess I thought telling the truth wouldn't make a difference. It wouldn't bring Amy back to life. But by now, I know that those were just cowardly, foolish thoughts of a cowardly and foolish woman. I know it's way too late, but for once, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to use the blood-stained costume as evidence. I never disposed of it. They're going to figure out which stains are Amy's and which are fake blood, all right. I'm going to name Mark and Blake, too. No more Halloween. No more playing zombie.
I was a high school senior and part of what you would call the popular kids, which meant when my friend David told me he was going to have a party out in the woods on Halloween night, I just knew there would be trouble. David's parties were always notorious for getting pretty wild, but that was to be expected. We lived in a small town where the best thing to do with your free time was either loiter around the library or go for a drive for the sake of driving. When a party was happening around here, next to everyone in our school showed up. You didn't really need an invite so much as just to know where the thing was being held. That fall was particularly bad for having nothing to do for us teens. Trick or treat was a bit past us at that point, and it was tricky to get our hands on any horror movies to watch with our limited resources and the lack of a video store. This would be the first and last time to memory that there would be a party out in those woods, not that I knew it at the time. David told us all about his little plan in the first week of October, so we all suddenly became a lot more focused on coming up with cool costumes to wear to impress our classmates and not our studies. A fact that made my parents already a bit annoyed with me, but I kept in their good books by doing extra chores around the house. When the night did finally come, I ended up going as a zombie. Pretty cliche, I know, but I put a little extra into it. One of my favorite subjects in school was art, specifically anything that had to do with painting and textures. I used what little skills I had to paint myself up in a sickly gray color first. Across the parts of me that would be visible, I put bloody gashes and festering wounds. I'd have to take one hell of a shower the next day, but it'd be so worth it. Over the top of that, I slipped on an old shirt I had picked up from the thrift store and ripped to hell to make plenty of ragged holes. A set of matching pants and old shoes which were falling apart already without further change to them closed off the ensemble. The last addition to my costume, I wouldn't paint on until after I was out the door and in my friend's old pickup truck. My parents weren't exactly thrilled with me going to the party in the first place, but if they saw the inverted cross I painted on my forehead, they would have flipped. They were old-fashioned to say the least. Perhaps then, I only even wanted to add that to be extra edgy, try to push the envelope. Without it though, I sometimes wonder how things would have gone differently. We ended up arriving at the party a couple of hours late. My buddy had forgotten the beer he was going to bring, and he made us double back to his house to get it, which added to the already hour delay we had getting there. That was more than fine though, because when we showed up to the party, already in progress with a couple of cases hoisted above our heads, we were met with a round of cheers. I had to hand it to David. The party was a hell of a lot better than I thought it would be. He must have had a few of the guys help him out because the entire place was decked out with decorations. A bonfire roared in the center of the party, giving it plenty of light along the other sources of light that had been set up. Crudely carved jack-o'-lanterns were scattered around the clearing, and best of all, there were plenty of snacks and drinks set up on a few folding tables. There must have been at least 100 people there when we arrived, and the majority were already buzzed. That meant that I was egged on to catch up as my friends dragged me into the mess of dancing and drinking, quickly diving headfirst into what the night had in store. The next couple of hours, the party was the typical fiasco. Dancing, music, hanging out on the sidelines or by the snacks. It was a real good time overall, and I had my fair share of drinks. I did, however, try to balance it out somewhat with some water. My parents didn't know about the booze that was going to be at the party, though they probably had their suspicions, so I had to try to be able to act at least somewhat sober when I got home. Eventually though, the party started to thin out. 100 turned to 50, which eventually turned to around 20 people. All of us were huddled around the fire at this point, which was burning lower than it had been before, and some of the guys were doing their best attempts to tell scary stories to try to scare the girls. They were god-awful, but it made for some pretty good entertainment from the sidelines at least. From the sidelines, I felt the sudden call of nature and excused myself, staggering off into the bush to take care of it. Now, there were still enough people that I made sure to go deeper into the woods than I normally would to avoid being seen. Turns out, when you're a bit messed up, It can be kind of tricky to orientate yourself in the woods at night, even with the near full moon above. After I'd finished my business, I stumbled in what I thought was the direction of the party, only to find myself in deeper and deeper brush. I'm not sure how long I walked lost, as my sense of time was already way past gone, and the trees around me held no answers for that either. This walking was suddenly interrupted with a sharp scream that rang out somewhere in front of me. It sounded like a girl and was quickly followed by cries for help. I quickly looked around and picked up the heaviest looking branch I could find before going towards the sound. I wasn't exactly the bravest kid, but with a bit of alcohol and my adrenaline already on high from being lost, I ignored any signs of danger from a situation like this. Following the sounds of struggle, I eventually spotted the cause. From the distance, I could see a crimson-robed figure who was chasing after what looked like a girl covered in red. The only light there had been at this point was from the moon, but curiously enough, I could see what looked like lit torches on the nearby trees. I moved myself closer, keeping to the shadows cast by those torches as best I could, while the robed figure finally seemed to catch up to the girl and throw her against a tree. At that point, I was only maybe 20 feet away and watched as the guy pulled an all too real looking knife out from underneath his robe, raising it above the girl's head. With a shout, I charged the guy from behind with my heavy branch in hand. All they were able to do was whirl around and look at me before the branch connected hard with the side of their head. The robed figure fell to the ground with a thud, and their hood was knocked off, revealing a bald-headed man that had strange symbols painted across his face. I was breathing hard at that point, but I didn't take time to think about what those things might have meant. Now that I was closer to her, I realized that the girl was without any clothing at all. Most of her body instead was covered in what looked like to be a mixture of dried blood and those same kind of strange symbols. When I finally made eye contact with her from behind her long dark hair and asked if she was okay, I could have sworn that in her eyes I saw excitement. There had been some sort of flash of unnatural emotion when she looked up at me that, at that time, I never really processed. Before I had the chance to think about it, she quickly wrapped her arms around me crying and said she was fine but needed help. These guys had dragged her out into the woods and had been preparing her body for a ritual when she managed to escape. I tried to reassure her that she would be fine and gave her my name. She told me hers was Lillian. I gave her my t-shirt that I had on underneath my ruined dress shirt, and she put it on quickly before we left. It wouldn't be much, but at the very least, it would cover her up a bit. She took it and wiped the tears away from her eyes. I took the guy's knife off the ground as well. It had a handle that seemed to be coated in silver, a dark purple gem stuck to the bottom, and a black blade that was razor sharp. I must have been gone from the party for some time, because it only took us maybe another 10 or 20 minutes before we could hear my friends shouting my name into the woods. Me and Lillian had moved quietly, trying to avoid any encounters with the crazy fucks that were out here, so we almost didn't come out at first, until I spotted David with a flashlight in hand. I took Lillian by the hand and led her over to my friends. A lot of them were relieved to finally find me, but suddenly had a ton of questions when they saw who I was with and the state she was in. Then David saw my arm. He pointed to it and asked if that was part of my makeup. I looked over to where he was pointing and saw that my left sleeve was completely soaked with blood. Apparently, when the cultist guy had turned, he actually managed to get a quick slash in that struck me on the shoulder. It wasn't extremely deep, but obviously enough to have caused a lot of bleeding. Adrenaline must have made me not even realize it, but now that it was pointed out, it started to sting like a son of a bitch. I told them all what happened, and they probably wouldn't have believed me if I didn't have that wound. It was Halloween after all, and pranks around this time were always rampant. All of us made it back to camp in record time, as they took my word that there was a good chance these woods had some crazy assholes looking to stab someone. When we got back, they managed to get the girl a pair of pants, as someone had an old pair in the back of their truck. Before putting them on though, she asked us if we had any wet cloths that she could use to wipe herself clean of the blood and marks. We ended up ripping a piece of cloth from one of the decorations that was a Grim Reaper. Well, they helped the girl, and I went to go and get a first aid kit that one of my survival buddies liked to keep in his glove compartment. Now, he had parked a better distance away than most of the vehicles, but it was still within earshot of the music that still played on in the background. I pulled out the first aid kit and ripped off the ruined sleeve that had hung on by a thread. The disinfectant burned when it hit the wound, but it did its job, and after I slapped a band-aid across it, I quickly scanned the woods around me. There still didn't seem to be anyone out there yet, but I felt like we should probably just leave right away and come back tomorrow under daylight to clean up. As I walked back to the camp, I started to notice something was off. The closer I got, the louder the music became, yet I heard no voices speaking. Only the sound of cheesy Halloween music was heard as I walked down that dirt path. That was the same music that must have dampened any of the struggle. It was when I approached the edge of the campsite that I saw the first body. I couldn't even tell who it was, as their face had been mangled beyond recognition, almost looking like a smashed pumpkin. I didn't have that knife anymore, but I still ran into the camp. All around were the remains of my friends. It looked like they had been put into a blender. Body parts were strewn across the campsite. Organs hung from nearby tree branches, and standing there in the middle of it all was Lillian. Her head tilted back and scanned around the scene like she was admiring a work of art. When I finally saw her face, I could see that it had a smile across it, one that only blossomed when she spotted me. I tried to ask her what happened, but couldn't muster the words when I looked at her. I realized that her body was covered in blood again, but this time it was fresh. There were no signs of those symbols on her though. Not a single one was left visible. I took a few steps back from her and fell to my ass as she approached. She still sported that smile as she leaned down in front of me. Carefully, she put her hands on my head, pulled my head forward against her lips, kissing the inverted cross. When she let go, I felt a searing pain in my skull and fell onto the ground in agony. All I could do then was watch with my head turned to the side as she walked off into the forest. The last words I heard from her before I slipped into unconsciousness were, "Thank you for helping me. I won't forget that." I was woken up the next day by police officers that had been called out after numerous reports of kids not returning home the morning after. What followed was a blur. I told them my story, and of course they didn't initially believe me. It was only when they did a search of the woods that they stumbled across the remains of the cultist. They too were dead, and in much worse ways than my friends were. I never got the details of what had happened to them, but a few of the cops who had been on the crime scene ended up quitting only a couple months later. The entire event was ultimately chalked up to a fanatical group going crazy in the woods, killing each other and stumbling across an unfortunate group of teenagers who were having a party nearby. I was only left alive due to my costume, they said. My unconscious body must have looked already dead. I knew better, though. Turns out the cross had been burned into my forehead. I grew my hair over it, but whenever someone catches a glance of it, I know what they must think. It doesn't look like a scar. The clean edges of the inverted cross are almost good enough to call a tattoo. Every Halloween night since then, I wonder what really happened in those woods. I wonder if that man in the robes was really about to murder a girl in cold blood, or if he was trying to stop something that they had brought into this world, but couldn't contain.
The early hours of the morning are my favorite time to work. At least, if I'm not waking up at that time. I prefer working through the night to early mornings because that's when the world is silent and everything seems to pause. It was 2 a.m. on a Monday. I sat in front of my computer with my headphones on, editing some audio for a video I was making. I was about halfway through when I heard a weird sound in the playthrough. It was faint and hollow, like a howl. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Late nights tend to mess with your mind. I replayed the clip, and there it was again. I thought it was weird and zoomed in on the waveform to see if I could isolate the sound. But I found nothing out of the ordinary. Perhaps it's just the effects added, I thought as I stripped the clip from all effects and replayed. That distinct howl is still there. It's not like a wolf howl, if that's what you're thinking. It's like a slow intake of air hitting aluminum, sounding almost otherworldly. I check other clips and the sound is there too. I'm not a paranoid person, but the thought of ghosts crosses my mind and suddenly I feel very small. I try to continue working, but I suddenly feel like I'm being watched. I take off my headphones and look behind me. Nothing there. I keep them off because I feel vulnerable with them on. I move on to color grading and try to not focus on the fact that my lights are dimmer ever so slightly, or the fact that I have a slight chill. I don't even flinch when I feel a light pressing of fingertips on my right shoulder. I write it off as my mind playing tricks on me. But then the feeling presses harder, like an itch, and I look over, but I see nothing. I still feel it there, though. Curious, I shift the collar of my oversized tee over to bare my shoulder. Light pink press marks bruise my skin, and I start to panic. I leave my room and turn on every light in my path. I went to the bathroom and washed my face with cold water to wake me up. I stare for some time in the mirror, breathing to calm me down. After some time, I went back to my room, and it was lighter and not as cold. I sit down and resume working on my project. Curious, I go back to listening to the clips to see if the howl is still there. It wasn't. It was completely gone.
It seemed like the perfect day for a walk. The sun was shining, the leaves were just starting to change color, and the biting color of impending winter wasn't on the winds quite yet. Fred didn't even bother bringing a jacket. He decided to finally check out the riverside trail that went past his apartments. The view, according to one of his neighbors, was beautiful this time of year. They're not wrong, Fred thought, watching an orange leaf float down the river. While he considered turning around and making his way back home, Fred noticed something in the distance. Along the side of the trail, near a tree, was what looked like a $1 bill. He could see the small 100 on the corner. Fred knelt down to pick up the bill, and just as his fingertips connected to it, the stranger struck.
"Sorry about all this,"
the stranger said. Fred's eyes fluttered open. "What? Where am I?" He was lying on the ground, and his head was pounding. From his spot in the grass, Fred could feel that the back of his head was wet. Blood, probably, he considered.
"You're nowhere important,"
the stranger replied.
"Listen, I'm not going to tell you whether to cry out for help. I'd appreciate it if you did, but I'm not picky."
Fred looked toward his feet and saw that the stranger was making sure that the chain attached to his ankle was secure. The other end was nailed to the ground with a stake. His duffel bag of supplies had more clamps and chains inside. The stranger stood up.
"Okay, now, scream or don't. Do whatever you want."
He picked up his bag and started walking away. Fred got to his feet. "Wait, what are you doing? Let me go."
"No can do, friend,"
the stranger called out.
"I like that, though. Keep yelling."
Fred started pulling at his chain. The stake wasn't budging, and the clasp around his ankle seemed secure. He wasn't going anywhere. "Hey, what are we doing? Where am I? Help!" Fred looked around and could only see trees around the small clearing. The stranger sat his bag down near a tree, picked up a hunting rifle and aimed it toward Fred. "Don't shoot me, please," Fred screamed, cowering in fear. "Why are you doing this?" A great guttural roar rang out through the forest.
"That's why,"
the stranger called out. Oh God, Fred realized, watching a large form approach from past the tree line. He looked over at the stranger, who may as well have become invisible in the taller grass. He's hunting something else. I'm the bait.